In this video, we will be taking a look at the biology of stress and some of the biological effects that stress has on our physiological system. We'll start with a definition. Stress can be defined as the process by which we perceive and respond to certain events, often called stressors, that we appraise as threatening or challenging. The key words in this definition are the cognitive ones: perception and appraisal. So it is not the event itself that triggers the stress response. It is the meaning or the way that we perceive the event to be that gives it meaning and that makes an event or a situation stressful or not to each individual. So keep in mind that cognition and perception in particular, how we interpret information and the meaning that we give to it, is what is going to be key to what triggers the stress response. It's not the event itself. And keep in mind, one of the quotes from your textbook is that the mind and the body interact. Everything psychological is simultaneously physiological. Again, just emphasizing that mind-body connection. Stress is not merely a stimulus or merely a response. It is a process, and it's the process by which we appraise and then cope with environmental threats and challenges. And so as this diagram shows, we have kind of a choice point. So we have a stressful situation or a potentially stressful situation, in this case, a very difficult or challenging test coming up. We have kind of two options. When we are faced with this particular stressful situation, we can appraise or view the situation as a threat. Yikes, this is beyond me, this is awful, what am I going to do? I'm not prepared, I don't understand this. And this type of cognitive appraisal is likely then to trigger a reaction that's closer to being, kind of freezing up and procrastinating and essentially putting off and probably not doing very well. So the response to this event is different, and it often is determined by our appraisal. If, on the other hand, the same difficult math test, another student or a student in a different situation, a different place, might take the same situation and say, oh, yeah, this isn't great, but I do have a test coming up, I better start studying now, I've got to apply everything I know, and you perceive it more as a challenge or something you have to do and get through rather than as a threat. And if you kind of appraise it as a challenge, the emotional reaction is more likely for you to be aroused, focused, and actually take the steps needed to follow through and actually get ready for this upcoming math test. So the point is, it's our cognitive appraisal that determines how we react and what the emotional meaning we give to the big events in our life. So for example, when short-lived or taken as a challenge, stressful situations can have a positive effect. They can get us focused, they can kind of get us on task. However, if these stressful situations are perceived as threatening or they're chronic and prolonged, they can have harmful effects on our physiology. So what are some of these biological changes that take place in our body when we are faced with real or perceived stressful situations? So it all goes back to our basic previous coverage of the human nervous system. And you may recall we have a central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system, which is subdivided. And if we take a quick look ahead into this picture, the peripheral nervous system then is subdivided into the neurons that control autonomic functions such as our internal organs and glands, as well as the voluntary movements of the skeletal muscle, the so-called somatic division of the peripheral system. And the autonomic nervous system is then further subdivided into the structures and the neural processes that cause arousal or activating responses, such as the dilation of our pupils, the increase in heart rate and respiration, the inhibition of digestion. These were some things that we talked about previously in the emotion material. And the parasympathetic division then is the other process of the autonomic system that helps to kind of relax and calm us back down after an arousing situation. So the autonomic nervous system increases heart rate and blood pressure. It results in the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands. Medulla part refers to the center of the adrenal gland, so it's the center part in collection of neurons and nerve cells that release the norepinephrine and the epinephrine. And on the surface of the adrenals is a cortex, and that is where you're going to find the release of these stress hormones. Those are the cells that release the cortisol and related stress hormones. So the adrenal glands, part of the endocrine system, also play a significant role, and they release both the cortisol, the stress hormones, as well as the epinephrine and norepinephrine. Walter Cannon, and you may remember Cannon's name from the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, Cannon proposed that the stress response was a fight or flight response marked by the outpouring of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the medulla, or the inner portion of the adrenal glands. And this causes, this epinephrine, norepinephrine release causes the increase in heart rate, respiration, increase in respiration rates, the mobilization of your body for energy sources such as sugar, fats, and also some analgesia. And these seem to be kind of reflexive survival reflexes, but they're mediated by this part of our nervous system and this part of the endocrine system. In the short term, when our body goes through this fight or flight response, it can actually be very beneficial. It can help us prepare to react quickly to important situations such as fighting, fleeing, mating. The release of cortisol and those stress hormones from the adrenals can convert protein and fats to energy sources for our bodies to be used so we can respond quickly to emergency situations. This increased blood flow and behavioral responsiveness can have a very advantageous effect. So the human body is wired to have this kind of stress response in the short term because it does get us out of bad situations. It maximizes our survival. However, this fight or flight response is not always triggered by immediate real dangers. In our very stressful world and with our more developed cerebral cortex, human beings have a tendency sometimes to kind of talk ourselves into a lot of stress-related anxiety. And so for many of us, we kind of live in a chronically stressed out physiological state. And as this slide reveals, being in this kind of chronic autonomic nervous system arousal state for too long or too chronically can actually start to have negative health-related consequences. It can lead to ulcers, high blood pressure, high blood cholesterol, and different cardiovascular disease effects. Having too much of the cortisol and the stress hormones surging through our circulatory all the time can suppress our immune system by somehow interfering or attacking the immune system cells, making us vulnerable to illnesses and possibly to cancer and things like that. The glucocorticoids, which include the cortisol and the stress hormones from the adrenal glands, can increase blood pressure, which in vulnerable people who already have some underlying processes that might make this more likely to occur. It can lead to heart attacks and stroke when the arteries are weakened or blocked with kind of clogging plaque from a high-fat diet, which narrows those passageways. And so having too much blood pressure going through these narrowed passageways can increase to heart attacks and strokes in the brain. Muscle tissue can be damaged. Children who are overly stressed chronically can be smaller, and their growth can be inhibited relative to their same age peers who are not exhibiting the same stress. It can inhibit the inflammatory response, which makes it more difficult for our bodies to heal. It can accelerate the aging process, and there's some evidence that it can even contribute to brain damage by interfering with some of the nerve cells in the hippocampus and leading to memory problems, etc. And so these are just some of the biological consequences of having a high amount of these stress hormones and these physiological processes, and just reminds us why it's important for us all to learn stress management strategies to get our biological stress response under control so we are not vulnerable to these stress-related problems, which are pretty common in our society. One researcher who studied this biological stress response was a man by the name of Hans Seeley. He worked with non-human critters, rats in particular, and he basically came up with this idea that there's a three-stage model called the GAS, or General Adaptation Syndrome, where the first phase of the GAS is alarm, when we are we first face a stressful situation and we perceive it as stressful. We see an increase, kind of a spike of these kind of biological effects as our body starts to build up a defense against this kind of this reaction. And so this alarm reaction, which is kind of like the sirens going off, and it just mobilizes our resources and basically says, all hands on deck, we have something important that we need to deal with. And so then there's a period, stage 2 of the general adaptation syndrome, called resistance, in which your body is in this heightened physiological effect and using resources. And what Hans Seeley's research found is that the body cannot maintain this indefinitely. If we don't do something in stage 2 to cope or to bring those physiological reactions down, we will go into stage 3, which is what he called exhaustion, where our energy resources are depleted, and this is the stage when humans and other creatures are vulnerable to stress-related problems. At this point, we will end this mini lecture on the biology of stress, and in the next lecture we will spend more time looking at the effects of stress on overall health and well-being. And I'd like you to think about the question of whether or not you believe we can improve our health by improving our cognitions. Can we actually lead a healthier life and be healthier, happier people just by changing the way that we think?